I think there's a select few institutions within society that are high priority targets for revolutionaries, really. So let's say you are of this Marxist, socialist, woke ideology, whatever. And actually, we've got an article on our Substack that breaks down the 100-year history of that idea. If anyone is interested, going from here's how the communists literally branded throughout the entire thing. Like long story short, in the 90s or so, the Marxists of the Western world realized that an economic argument wasn't going to work in the West for communism, because if you look at where communism did take a hold in the Eastern world, so Russia, China, Korea, and such, was they went straight from feudalism into communism. So people never had rights. They never had freedom. They never had economic prosperity. But it was pretty hard to radicalize the Western factory worker who's like, what do you mean? I work 45, 50 hours a week and I've got a family of 4, a house over our heads. Like, you're going to tell me that I need to fight this system? Like, I don't know, it's working for me.
System's great.
And so they couldn't, right. And so they couldn't radicalize the working class of the West. And the intellectuals realized this. And so they went, wait, so how do we get this? Which is funny because it's kind of an admittance that their idea is wrong. But they went, okay, well, how do we radicalize the people then? And what they realized was, we've got to start a culture war. And so it was, the way to attack the West is through their culture. There was a guy named Antonio Gramsci, who was one of the foundational Marxist thinkers, and he was actually in Italy during this period. But what he said was, we have to do a long march through the institutions. So if we want to bring communism to the West, we don't forget about the factory workers. We're not going to go get factory workers to rise up against their capitalist owner or whatever, right? We need to get into education. We need to get into military. We need to get into these very important institutions within a society. And we just need to get into administrative positions within those institutions. And that's how we're going to transform this society. So literally like 60, 70, 80 years ago, you can see the blueprint for what we're seeing today being laid. And it's been a decades-long approach by these revolutionaries. And it's been like a passing of the torch. It's not one person leading the charge. They're all like, people in this ideology are just finding new ways to fight for it. And so that's exactly why you're seeing the military do that. And so where I was going with this was that there's a select few institutions that are extremely important. One is governance. So like, you need the MPs and such. We need to infiltrate that sphere. And then education and also military. Those are like 3 of the most important aspects to corrupt if you want to take over a society. And, we can see it in our education as well. And so you look at these very important institutions, you go look at all their documents, and it's like, yeah, all the administrators are pushing this stuff. So that was the whole idea, was like, we need to get into positions of authority within these institutions, and then we need to push this agenda. And so for the last 40, 50 years, they've been trying to get into those positions, and now we're just seeing what happens when people with that ideology are in those positions.
Okay. So this makes a lot of sense in context of when I was in university. I was in the education department. I was one of the few heterosexual men that was there because I wasn't in the phys ed department. Like, I was always assuming, oh, you're in phys ed. I'm like, no, I'm in regular teaching. They're like, okay. But I could tell right away. I had straight up professors say, like, I don't like you. I'm like, but I don't dislike you. What's going on here? Like, why are you upset with me? But it's because I represented something that was very antithetical to what they wanted to do, because I represented the traditional male values, but I wasn't tracking. So now it makes sense that if somebody like myself were to be in their organization, I represent the pushback that they don't want. That makes a lot of sense because education was essentially captured by communists. It's a communist infiltration, but it seems like there's a pushback now. So here's my last question. I want to see if we can close this loop. We mentioned before we went online something about mental health here in the West with our soldiers, and mental health with soldiers. And I believe you mentioned the IDF. Is there a link there between this type of ideology and the mental health of our soldiers and our veterans?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, first of all, this ideology is a very bitter, resentful. It essentially gives you license to think that way and tells you that, yes, you're actually good if you're bitter and resentful because the world is oppressive, right? So I think the people that naturally pick up and implement this ideology, I think they're already mentally unwell. And I don't just mean that in a derogatory way, but I actually think anybody can go look at this. People that are more likely to believe these ideas are vastly overrepresented when it comes to things like crazy anxiety disorders and depression and such. But when it comes to the mental health within the military, what I was mentioning to you beforehand that is really interesting here is that, so you look at something like the IDF, and no matter what your opinion is on Israel or any of these situations, the mentality within those soldiers is that they are surrounded by hostile nations, which is a reality. And so for them, the fight is super important. It's on our front doorstep, right? Like if we don't fight today, tomorrow we're dead. Whereas in the Western world, we're miles, like thousands of miles away from the battlefield. So there's no direct, essentially, feeling like this is for self-defense. And I think subconsciously, a lot of veterans are picking up on that, being like, wait, if I didn't go fight in Afghanistan, would we really be that much unsafer in Canada? Maybe you can make arguments for it, for sure. But I think there's a little bit about that. And then and I'm grabbing this perspective from Sebastian Junger's book, Tribe, which is really interesting. And so what he pointed out was that an added aspect of that is, okay, I go across the world to fight a war. So it doesn't feel like it's on my front doorstep. It doesn't feel like it's highly necessary. I go fight that war. And then when I come back, my country is at war with itself. It's pulling itself apart. Nobody's like, so what am I even fighting for? And then also on top of that, to the woke aspect, okay, now I go over and I fight for the country and I come back and all my institutions are telling me that I'm evil, that I'm a problem. What the hell am I fighting for at this point? And then what ends up happening is your mind starts going, wait, all of those, we were talking about it earlier where people, if they believe when it comes to, say, the communists, well, our goal is so noble that therefore the means are justified. Now, look at this in this perspective is you go, I can understand, and I actually think there is moral scenarios where taking a life is the right thing to do. If somebody breaks into your home tonight and is threatening to kill your family, like, I don't think your psyche is going to have any issue dealing with that problem. And afterwards, you'll sit there and go, look, it was terrible. That was not a situation I ever want to be in again, but I don't regret taking that person's life to save my family. But put the exact same scenario in there where you take somebody's life and you don't have a moral justification for it. Well, now you've just done a terrible act. And I think, you would know better about this than I, so I'm not trying to make like a hard here. But let's assume, okay, take the Iraq war, for instance. You have a veteran that goes over, fights in the Iraq war, believes he's fighting for freedom to uphold democracy and protect his family. And then he has to do terrible things throughout that war, take people's lives. You hear soldiers talk about how, I had to kill a 12-year-old child because somebody had armed him with a suicide vest or of this nature. And then they get back, and what they end up realizing is the whole pretext, and I'm not putting the moral culpability on them, but the whole moral pretext for this war was that we were doing what was necessary, and these things were necessary for freedom and for democracy. But then now I've learned that, it was really just because Dick Cheney was getting rich with all his Halliburton friends, and the Iraq war never really needed to happen. In fact, Iraq in that region is in a worse place now than it was before we entered. And then now your mind has to go, well, what did I kill that 12-year-old child for?
Right.
I have no justification for that act anymore. Of course that's going to leave you with some trauma. And now I'm not casting shade upon somebody that was under that pretext going into the war and maybe did what they thought was necessary. But I don't think I would survive that mental struggle of going, shit, this was not at all what I thought it was for.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? I think this brings it all back to accountability. The wars, COVID, and I think the start of all of this, like the decay, the rot of our institutions. I don't have enough historical context, but when I kind of came online was September 11th. I just joined the army. The buildings came down. Shit, I think I might have to go to war. I'm 19 years old. I went 10 years later, but still the mindset was there. Something big is happening. And then the unfolding of the trust, because we start realizing, oh, wait, hold on a sec. Maybe we didn't have to do all these things. Maybe we didn't have to nation build. Maybe we didn't have to go into Iraq, like you just said. And then that, like, enter stage right. Now there's this big pandemic going on. I distrust to a certain extent because I realized maybe we shouldn't have been in the war. But the final nail in that coffin was the COVID pandemic. And for me, at least, I was able to find some solace, some comfort in the community, in writing, in doing podcasts, and just getting what was in my head out into the public. But I know a lot of individuals that they don't have that medium and they struggle. And for exactly what you're talking about here, and the ideology that gets supplanted into things like the military and into the veteran culture and into just general Canadian culture and American culture is not doing us any favors either. And that's why talking to guys like you is so important, man, because you've got a grasp of like the history and you're able to present it in a really easily digestible form. And I hope folks start following your channel a lot more closely and start bumping those views up. Now that the COVID era is kind of washed out and I think the censorship czars are starting to get kicked out, we need to get more people listening to what you're talking about because it's bang on, in my opinion.